Good evening. My name is Sandy Gill. I'm board chair at your Calgary Public Library, and it's my pleasure to be one of your MCs this evening and to welcome you to our latest Think Big event, a wonderful partnership between the Hotchkiss Brain Institute, Jay Ingram, and Calgary Public Library. Today's event also features the Mathison Centre for Mental Health Research and Education. We'd like to start this evening with a land acknowledgement. In the spirit of respect and truth, we acknowledge Mohkinstsis, the lands where the Elbow and Bow Rivers meet. In the spirit of truth and reconciliation, we recognize the ancestral territories, cultures, and oral practices of the Blackfoot people, the Iaitka Stoney Nakoda Nation, the Dene people of the Tsuut'ina Nation, and the Métis Nation of Alberta Region 3. Calgary Public Library serves the community on this traditional land, and we honor all people who share, celebrate, and steward the Treaty 7 territory of Southern Alberta. This land acknowledgement reminds us of the histories that precede us, highlights our responsibilities going forward, and helps bring us together on a shared journey of truth and reconciliation. The library gives everyone access to stories that entertain and instruct. It is a community hub where Calgarians can come together to learn and share ideas. The Hotchkiss Brain Institute, our partner for the Think Big series, is an internationally recognized center of excellence in brain and mental health, research, and education. HBI comprises more than 900 people, researchers, clinician scientists, scholars, students, and staff, all working towards a shared vision of healthy brains for better lives. The Mathison Centre is dedicated to advancing research and education on early identification, treatment, and prevention of mental illness. The HBI was established with a foundational donation from the Hotchkiss family, and the Mathison Centre was established with one from Mr. Ronald Mathison. Both are great examples of how philanthropic commitment from the community is essential for transformative brain and mental health research. Research that leads to improved health outcomes in the local community and beyond. I'd now like to introduce my fellow board member, Courtney Penner, who will also be one of your MCs this evening. Councillor Penner.
Good evening. My name is Courtney Penner, and I am pleased to be here as one of the MCs for this installment of the Think Big series. This evening will follow a similar format as they have in the past, where host Jay Ingram with speakers Dainara Exner-Cortnes and Carolyn Mitchell will participate in a panel discussion and then answer questions with the audience. We invite you to ask questions via the chat function on your screen, which looks like a little speech bubble. In addition to these questions in real time, we've received questions from the panelists beforehand, so we'll attempt to answer as many questions as time allows. Afterwards, you will receive an online comment card. Please take the time to fill it out, as it will help influence future Think Big events, both online and in person. Tonight, we are going to talk about intimate partner violence, specifically teen dating violence. 1/3 of teens in Canada will experience intimate partner violence, and those who do report higher rates of mental health problems. We will learn what research says about teen dating violence, how to respond to disclosures, and how to prevent it. And I can tell you that as a parent of children who are entering their first relationships, this conversation is important and timely. I am now pleased to welcome this evening's very special guests. Dainara Exner-Cortnes is a member of the Mathison Centre and the Hotchkiss Brain Institute. She's an assistant professor and Tier 2 Canada Research Chair in the Department of Psychology at the University of Calgary. Her research focuses on building healthy relationships as a foundation for well-being in childhood and adolescence. Among her key interests is the prevention of adolescent dating violence. Carolyn Mitchell works as the Real Talk Program Coordinator with Sagesse, an organization that works to disrupt cycles of domestic violence. She has a BA in psychology from the University of Lethbridge, and for the past 3 years has facilitated Real Talk with diverse groups of communities across Alberta to increase participants' capacity and confidence to talk about domestic violence. This evening's panel will be moderated by the wonderful Think Big host, Jay Ingram. Jay has hosted 2 national science programs in Canada, Quirks and Quirks on CBC Radio and Daily Planet on Discovery Channel Canada. He's written 16 books, which have been translated into 15 languages, has 6 honorary degrees, is a member of the Order of Canada, and a fellow of the Royal Canadian Geographical Society. I'm pleased to turn it over now to Jay.
Thank you, Councillor Penner, and welcome everybody to another installment, as Councillor Penner said, of Think Big. And tonight's topic is incredibly important. And I would just remind you now, if you've seen Think Big events before, you have an idea of how it goes. For those of you who might not have, both speakers will speak for anywhere from 7 to 10 minutes. Dr. Exner-Cortens is going to start, and Carolyn Mitchell will be second, because their roles are somewhat distinct in this issue. After they've spoken, and I may have posed just a couple of questions to each of them, we'll open it up at about 7:30-ish to questions from you. And as Sandy Gill said, or Courtney said, I don't remember which, you can pose questions in the chat function at the bottom of the screen. As I said, this is a truly important topic. When I was learning a little bit about it, I was actually shocked by some of the statistics, but you're not here to listen to me. So our first speaker I'd like to welcome right now is Dr. Danira Exner-Cortens.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Jay, and thanks for having me tonight. It's really great to get to speak about this issue. It is something that not a lot of people have heard about, but which does affect a lot of youth. So thank you for being here after I'm sure many of you have been on Zoom all day. I do want to say I'll be talking about violence and also homicide and suicide. So if you need to step out at any point, that's totally fine. And then you're welcome to come back. So to start at the end, the big takeaway that I'm hoping to share with you tonight is that dating violence is probably a lot more common than you think if you've thought about it at all. But fortunately, we can all play a role in preventing it. So it's a good news story, although what we'll be talking about is tough to hear. To get to that takeaway, I'm going to talk about what dating violence is, including how common it is, and why I think it's important to prevent it from happening. So to help get us started, I'd like you to think back to summer 2021, which feels like a very long time ago. But this past summer in late August, the Gabby Petito case captured a huge amount of attention in both the United States and Canada. So if you aren't familiar or you've forgotten, in this case, Gabby Petito, who was a young YouTuber traveling across the US in a van with her boyfriend, was found murdered in Grand Teton National Park. And while unfortunately, we'll never know for sure, as her boyfriend died by suicide a few weeks later, he was suspected of committing the murder. So during that time, and since then, I've thought about why people were so interested in this case. And there's a couple of reasons, I think. So the first is that I do think people found this case genuinely shocking. Young women who are on a trip across the country aren't supposed to die. We don't see in the news very often that young women are murdered by an intimate partner. So it might have been really surprising and shocking to you. Unfortunately, for people like Carolyn and myself who work in this area, it wasn't shocking. In Canada, we know that domestic homicides happen every year, and young women like Gabby in the age range of 15 to 24 are at the highest risk in Canada of being killed by a dating or intimate partner. The other reason I think people were interested is because there was footage of the couple a few days before her murder. It showed them interacting with the police. And this led to a lot of speculation about what could have been done to prevent her homicide. And these were really important questions, and questions about prevention are super important. and what we're going to spend most of our time talking about tonight. And they're also the focus of a lot of the research I do. Before we talk about prevention, though, let's take a step back and think about what dating violence is. So in my research, I work on what is known as adolescent dating violence. It's also called youth dating violence or teen dating violence. You might have heard those terms. They're all referring to the same thing. So adolescent dating violence, as I will call it tonight, is a form of intimate partner violence that happens to adolescents specifically. So that is youth between the ages of approximately 11 to 24, although all the research I do is with youth under the age of 18. So what is dating violence? A lot of people think about physical violence. So hitting, pushing, shoving, throwing things at someone, and that's certainly part of it. But dating violence can also be sexual in nature, and it can also be psychological. So somebody controlling you, telling you what you can do, where you can go, what you can wear, belittling you, yelling at you, and those kind of behaviors. So when any of those types of behaviors, physical, sexual, or psychologically aggressive behaviors happen within an adolescent dating and or sexual relationship, we call that adolescent dating violence. Dating violence also includes stalking, and then in the worst case, as we have discussed, can lead to homicide. Dating violence can happen in person or online and among all youth, regardless of their sexual or gender identity. And one of the things that people find really surprising when I talk to them about it is how young it can start. So perhaps not surprisingly, when adolescents begin dating, dating violence can start. And in Canada, that can be as young as grade 6. So as I mentioned, dating violence can happen to any youth, but again, how common it is might surprise you. It surprised Jay. It often surprises people. So based on a recent study that my team and I did, we found that about 1 in 3 youth in Canada in grades 9 and 10 have had experience with any form of dating violence. So those forms I just talked about in the past year. So 1/3 of youth in grades 9 and 10, and we have reason to believe it would be similar for grades 11 and 12. Of that, about 1 in 10 report that they were physically hurt by a partner, someone they were dating in the past year. And about 1 in 5 girls in Canada experience sexual violence in dating relationships every year. And although, as I mentioned, dating violence can happen to any youth, we know from our work and other work in the area that trans and non-binary youth are at the highest risk for experiencing dating violence because of the prejudice and discrimination they face at school and in society at large. So why should we care about this thing that is happening to approximately 1/3 of youth? I'm going to focus on mental health because this is for Bell Let's Talk, but I think there are a number of reasons we should care. But in terms of mental health, some research my team has done has found that youth who experience dating violence can report poor mental health outcomes long after the dating violence has hopefully stopped. So our research shows that girls who experience dating violence were more likely to report poor mental health, heavy drinking and smoking 5 years later, and that boys were more likely to report delinquent behavior, poor mental health, and marijuana use 5 years later. In more recent work that we've done that Jay referenced, we have found that both boys and girls who experience dating violence are at substantially increased risk to experience intimate partner or domestic violence in adulthood. And in our study, dating violence was one of the strongest risk factors for experiencing future violence. So one reason dating violence is important to prevent is to stop that cycle of violence from starting. Before I get to prevention, I just want to revisit the Gabby Petito case. So one of the critiques of the coverage was what is called missing white woman syndrome. And so that means that media and all of us tend to focus really heavily on cases of white affluent women who go missing and do not report or focus on violence against women and girls of color to nearly the same extent. And I think in part that's why people found the case so surprising, because they don't think that these homicides are happening. Unfortunately, they are, and they're just not often reported on. So it does happen a lot more often than we think. We do see that same pattern in Canada, and it's what initiatives like the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls are trying to address. And we do know, unfortunately, from our research and others, that women and girls of color and Indigenous women and girls are at much higher risk for experiencing violence because of Canada's history of colonization. So all that is kind of a downer. And so now we're going to talk about prevention and what we can do, because dating violence is preventable. And there's lots of things we can do. There's different approaches we can take. And I think we're going to talk about some of those today. But my key takeaway for now is that as caring adults, you have a role to play. We know that parents and other caregivers are very unlikely to talk to their children about dating violence, even though dating violence is more common than other risk behaviors we know parents care about, like smoking and binge drinking. Youth are also not very likely to reach out unprompted. And so it's really important that adults are prepared to have those conversations. And so I hope by being here tonight, you take away that dating violence is common, but also that it's something you as a caring adult should be aware of and ready to discuss with the youth in your life. And I think now Carolyn is going to talk more about prevention.
Yes, she will, but can I ask you just a quick question just, as a follow-up?
Yep.
Do you and your colleagues understand what the roots of violence might be? And I mean by that, the perpetrator, whether it's male, female, whomever it is, a teen of, some description. Is there some knowledge of what might prompt that?
There's some, not as much as you might hope. So that's something that we are working on. We think that dating violence really stems from unhealthy use of power in relationships. So that could mean somebody who witnessed domestic violence in their home or themselves experienced child maltreatment. That could mean someone who is involved with bullying behavior. That could mean someone who's experiencing racism and has a sense and lack of power in society. So we really try to situate it in unhealthy use of power. And, we can talk more about risk factors. Certainly the thing I always want to say is they are risk factors. Just because you've experienced something does not mean you're going to experience dating violence, but witnessing domestic violence and child maltreatment are fairly strong predictors of future dating violence involvement.
So in some cases, it can, I think, fairly be called intergenerational then. If you're exposed, let's say, in the home to violence, you might be more predisposed.
Yeah, we do. We think about these cycles of violence that can start in childhood and then extend to adulthood. But there's, first of all, it's never guaranteed. And also there's many points to intervene along the way, but that cycle is something we are trying to prevent through dating violence prevention initiatives.
Well, thank you, Tanira. We'll be back to you for the Q&A. And Carolyn, sorry I delayed your entrance onto the stage, but please, let's hear from you now.
Wonderful. Thank you, Jay. And thank you, everyone, for inviting me here this evening. I was really looking forward to the opportunity to share a little bit about the work that I do in regards to our topic around intimate dating violence and adolescent dating violence. So as mentioned, I work at an organization called Say Just. We are a domestic violence prevention society. At Say Just, I coordinate what we call our Real Talk program, which is a workshop for anyone who is interested in learning how to recognize domestic violence, understand its impact, and develop comfort in responding to disclosures. And over the past few years, I have been invited to speak at different high schools in Calgary to help students understand what is domestic violence and then also adolescent dating violence and how they can support their friends or peers who might be experiencing it. So tonight, my real perspective, my panelist really came from the research perspective. I'm here to share my learnings out of the discussion that came from these workshops with students and with youth, and why I think it is so important for all of us, all caring adults, to be talking about dating violence at any age and at any stage. And so having conversations like the one we are having here tonight, I think is really key to how we look at prevention at Say Just. We know there are many people, not only the caregivers, the parents, who have opportunities to have these conversations with youth, which is why a big part of the way we look at prevention at Say Just is about engaging what is called informal supporters. We know that most of the time when any person is experiencing any kind of violence, whether that be domestic violence or dating violence, oftentimes they are not going to talk to their formal supporters first. Formal supporters being Organizations like Say Yes, calling any 24-hour domestic violence hotline, most of the time they're not going to reach out to those formal supports first. In fact, we know 80% of the time people are talking to their informal supporters first. Their informal supporters being their friends, their peers, their teachers, their coworkers, their neighbors, school counselors, any person that they trust, who they feel safe sharing their stories with, and people they trust come in many different forms. And so I think that really builds off of the comment as mentioned by my co-panelist, Dr. Exter Cortens, or caregivers are not likely to talk to their children about adolescent dating violence as often. However, not only do caregivers perhaps are less likely to talk about dating violence, but perhaps teens, what we know, teens might not want to talk to their primary caregiver about their romantic relationships as well, which is why the information we are talking about tonight is truly relevant to everyone. Because if you are a grandparent, a teacher, a doctor, an active community member, as any caring adult, you might have the opportunity to make a big difference by talking about and raising awareness around dating violence. And so some of my major learnings that I took from the workshops that I've been able to run with youth in those school settings, there's a few different reasons why I think youth could really benefit themselves from learning about adolescent dating violence and really bringing in that conversations to them at a really early age. Some common themes, a common theme that I do see present itself in multiple workshops and many of them, as there's often a lot of stigma around dating violence that youth are already absorbing at that stage all the time through media, through conversations, through things that we hear or see about any kind of dating violence. For example, oftentimes in our conversations in those real talk workshops with youth, there is often already the gendered terms around how we identify the person who is experiencing the violence, usually identified as female, and the person using the violence is often being labeled as male. There's also the assumption that violence is always physical, that is the only type of violence that we're referring to when we say dating violence is the physical acts of violence. There's already that assumption that's incredibly present. And the not understanding that of when controlling behavior becomes what is formally called coercive control, the really intense and dangerous levels of control that can have serious impacts on someone's daily life. So kind of all of those things are already starting to take shape at that age. And so some examples of that is in the workshop, we do go through different case studies. And often I hear students comment things like, she should have stopped her partner before it got this bad. I don't understand why she stayed. I would have left the first time my partner tried to control me. They make assumptions based on the misconceptions about dating violence that is often perpetuated, as I mentioned. And while this is not a new thing, it is still a thing that is really prevalent and really happening. And so the other big takeaway that I really hope people take from this quick presentation I'm giving here as well is that youth want to talk about it as well. They want opportunities to engage in this conversations. In those workshops that I run, there's a lot of times where students come forward and ask, for examples. They want to clarify, is this what you're talking about in terms of dating violence? Would you characterize this as controlling behavior? They ask really specific contexts like, would stalking someone on social media be considered dating violence? Or my friend can't hang out with me unless they ask their partner first. Is that controlling behavior? And while certainly when we're talking about those examples in the context of dating violence, for youth who don't have the opportunities to learn or talk about it, there's often a lot of questions around when control becomes coercive and harmful. And the other reason I think it is why youth really want to engage in the conversation is, and this has certainly happened much more often when we're able to do these in-person workshops, and whenever we can get back to doing those, I imagine this is a pattern we'll see again. But oftentimes, just by bringing that conversation forward, there were often disclosures that happen in those workshops as well. A youth who would come forward and say that they have either experienced dating violence themselves or that they have had friends who they felt were in controlling relationships, but they weren't sure how to talk to them about it or how to ask them about it. And the students who did disclose are just the ones who feel comfortable talking about it in those settings and who feel comfortable talking about it to me as pretty much a stranger and in front of all of their peers in a classroom, which really tells me that they want to talk about their experiences with people that they trust. And it's something that's common and it's something that's happening that we should be talking about a lot more, because it is common and it is happening. So talking about youth, about adolescent dating violence and healthy relationships is important because, as we mentioned, it is common. These statistics that were mentioned earlier, maybe, we should all have the language and knowledge to talk about and understand these experiences when they happen. And so that is, I think, a real importance in terms of engaging youth in the conversation around dating violence. And just some of the big learnings that I've taken away from my work.
Thank you, Carolyn. This may be a difficult question, but let's say that in one of your workshops or in some situation that suggests you're talking to a teen and you suspect that there may be issues there that they're dealing with. How difficult is it to encourage them to talk to you?
If you're saying if I suspect that something is happening.
That's right.
If I suspect something is happening and they don't immediately tell me about it, it's very rare. I don't think I can ever name an example of when that has happened. But in those kind of settings, what I would typically do is I would say, I hope you would talk about this with someone, with any person that you trust, whether that's your peers, whether that's a trusted teacher or a parent, with someone, and really just try to highlight where they can go to talk about it further when they feel ready to do so, because you can never force someone in the moment to talk about something they're not ready for, and certainly not with someone that maybe they don't have that level of trust with. So that is an interesting question, though.
But you did say that quite often they want to talk.
Mm-hmm.
And so if parents are in a situation and they don't have the skills and the experience that you have, I mean, this may be a silly question, and if it is, you can just tell me, but are there sort of tips for parents who maybe suspect that something's going on to allow them to kind of bring the subject out in the open?
Yeah, absolutely. I think if parents think that something is going on, and what's interesting is I would suggest the same thing for anyone, regardless of age, is it's really trying to address the patterns of behavior that the parent is noticing, perhaps in their child, of saying things like, it seems like you're always nervous when you pick up your phone, or it seems like you're not able to spend as much time with the family as you used to, or it seems like maybe this relationship is taking up a lot of your time. Are these things that are a concern for you, and are these things that you want to talk about? So we're really naming the reason why we're trying to have this conversation with them, and we're letting them know that we see it and we're open to talking about it with them when they're ready to do so. So I think really trying to get to the point as to why we're asking and why we think it's important to talk about it could be a great way to open up the conversation.
Do you ever have the opportunity to talk to somebody who's actually doing the violence, whether it's just, social coercion or bullying all the way up to physical violence?
In my particular role, I can honestly say that in any of my workshops, I've never had a person who came forward and self-disclosed that they were a person who uses violence. Although that is actually something that in my more general workshops is something that we discuss is, how do you respond to someone who is the one using violence? Because I do also think that's a really important conversation, is to know how to respond, how to react, where to refer a person who is using violence to further support. So while I've never been in that position myself, I imagine because there's a lot of the additional concern around the shame a person might feel if they're using violence and wants to come forward and say that they're a person who uses that kind of behavior can perhaps be even rarer to get those disclosures than even a person who is experiencing the violence. So I don't have those opportunities, but I do hear about people, informally within their, family or friends who have had those disclosures themselves and came and asked me about how they should guide those conversations.
Yeah, they may be incredibly difficult conversations to have, but obviously extremely important. Danira, if we could ask you to come back on stream. I'm going to just relate to two of you some of the questions that we've received in the poll. And as I said earlier, whoever feels like they'd like to answer the question, please go ahead. So one of the questions that came, and it may be a bit general, but take your best shot at it. How best can somebody who's trying to help actually support a teen who has had violence, in whatever kind we're talking about, inflicted on them? How best to support them?
Carolyn, do you want to go first? Then I can follow up. It's your
Sure.
wheel.
No, absolutely. When I think of the ways people can support teens who might be experiencing it, I think one of the biggest things that you can do is work to really reduce the isolation of what they're experiencing. You're really trying to keep open lines of communication. We're making sure we're not forcing them to do something that they are not, ready to do. But we're giving them as many options as possible, and we're really reinforcing the trust that's already there, because if they're telling us about their experiences, there's already a really high level of trust there. And we want to make sure we maintain that so that they always feel like they do have a person that they can go to for support when and if they ever need to. So really just trying to allow them the space to talk about their experiences and offer them options is, I think, a really, really great place to start in terms of support.
Yeah, I agree. And I think all of that, and then the support starts before the dating violence. So you probably, wouldn't expect a great outcome if you just went to your teen and said, like, are you using drugs? You start talking about that much earlier in terms of what might be healthy and not healthy, what your expectations as a family are, what your concerns are. So you've already built an environment where you're talking about this and letting them know it's okay for them to ask you questions if they're not sure. And it's the same with relationships. If if you haven't done that, it's better to ask than not. But if you can build that environment where when they're younger, you're talking about boundaries and they can choose who they want to hug, they can make decisions about their body, consent, and then kind of continuing the conversation into thoughts about dating, relationships, as that becomes developmentally relevant, so that they already know this is something you're interested in. You want to hear their opinions on. A good starter can be, what do you think? I saw this in the news. I went to this talk tonight. What do you think about that? So just letting them know that you do want to hear about that. So if they need to disclose something, they know you're interested and would want to hear it.
Interesting question in the chat. Do those who abuse their partner also mistreat others?
So we don't know as much from a research perspective, about individuals who use violence as we'd like to. Part of the reason is for youth. There's a lot of our data is collected in schools, and a lot of schools don't want us asking about perpetration. But it appears there is probably a couple of different reasons why youth might use violence. So there are youth for whom it's due to a lack of healthy relationship skills. So not being able to deal with conflict in a relationship and using violence instead of healthy communication, all the way up to youth who are absolutely using it in what we might think of as a more typical adult pattern, in an abusive way. And maybe we would think those people who are using it that way might be more likely to mistreat others. So we do also know there's a connection between bullying perpetration and dating violence perpetration. So there does seem to be some connection, but the research we have on that is still emerging.
Carolyn, do you have a comment on that?
I think that was summed up very well. And based on what we know and what we see is, just if someone is using violence, it doesn't necessarily mean that they are going to be, violent or abusive to everyone. Often it is very intentional towards, the person they are wanting to control. So it does not necessarily mean that they are always going to be perceived as that violent person. In fact, they might come off as very kind and charismatic. There's not one way you can really, I think, label them.
Yeah. And I think just to add to the stigma, I think we know from adults, and, I think it would also apply to some teens, that people who use violence with partners are absolutely wonderful in the rest of their life. And so for victims to come forward is really hard, because people would say, well, I know them and they're not like that. So I think, to what Carolyn said, just it can look a lot of different ways, and not making assumptions that well, if it was happening, it would look like this. So really believing a person if they come and talk to you about it is super important.
There's a question that we got from the poll. If helping teens with this issue different from helping adults? And if so, how?
So is helping teens different than helping adults
Yeah.
is the question.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. I think to me, there's subtle differences, and I'm certainly open to discussion about it. But what's always interesting to me from my real talk lens is the things that I talk to youth about in those real talk workshops is actually really similar to what I talk to adults about in just the general real talk workshops. Certainly, I think the resources available and perhaps, the responsibility of adults to talk to parents or talk to, to have to make those calls to services if they feel like that, child or that adolescent is in immediate danger. Those kind of responses are a little bit different. But the overall, how we support someone by listening, by having open conversations, by offering options, by trying to make them feel as safe with us as possible is actually pretty consistent. I think regardless of age. So it's always interesting to me going back and forth and thinking I'm actually saying very much the same thing to people of all ages.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think the response is the same. I think I'm a developmental psychologist, so for me, the one difference is they are developing beings. They're developing a sense of identity and who they are, and dating violence can kind of get mixed in with that. It also means they're still developing the capacity to use healthy relationship skills and assertive communication and not violence. So there's a lot of potential to teach better ways to manage conflict in relationships. Also, some of the concerns might be different, just given their context and that they're likely living with caregivers, but definitely the response and listening and validating is very much the same.
It's really interesting how the questions coming in on the chat overlap in a lot of ways with the questions that we derived from the poll. Let me see if I can just combine one here. One of the questions is, how can we tell what signs to recognize when this is maybe not yet happened or is just about to happen? And a different version of that question is, how might a person be able to detect or predict another person as being a potential perpetrator of violence? This question goes on. For instance, if you observe someone abusing animals, is there any kind of correlation that this person might progress from animal abuse to adolescent violence against a partner? So I'm not trying to make this question too complicated, but I think it is on people's minds because prevention is so important. Are there signs that one can look for?
Mm-hmm. I can answer from the research and then Caroline can talk from her experience. So we don't have a predictor that, and I think people are often looking for what is the thing? We have, signs we can look for, but we shouldn't expect that these would always be present. So I'll say some, but just with the caveat that really it's about knowing that youth and noticing changes, like Caroline was saying, and really noticing behaviors that are different and kind of just make you go that doesn't make me feel super comfortable and I want to talk to them about that. But some signs can be a change in physical appearance. So wearing way more makeup, not wearing makeup, changing clothes, self-harming, potentially being more withdrawn, having changes around peers or in school. So maybe stopping seeing some of their friends they've always seen, losing friendships, not being able to concentrate, doing poorly at school when that's a change, being anxious around their partner. And then as Carolyn mentioned, changes with family. So being anxious when they look at their phone, withdrawing from family activities. So and then similarly for using violence, how are they talking to their partner? Does it seem like they're controlling their partner? They're being very jealous? Are they respecting their partner's boundaries? So these are sort of general signs, but it really is about for that individual youth, knowing who they are. Does this behavior seem different? And being curious about why that might be happening, because it could be dating violence and it could be other things as well. In terms of the pet question, it's a really good one. We know more about that for adults. So for adults, it is a strong risk factor of very extreme use of violence. There's reason to believe that's also the case for adolescents. So if they are hurting pets, that would be something you would really want to seek mental health services for, because they're at risk of a number of adverse outcomes. So that is something. I was going to put it on my list of warning signs, but it's very rare. But if you were to see that, that is definitely a concerning behavior.
Carolyn, anything to add to what Daenerys said?
I think I just echo a lot of what Daenerys said on a general scale. We do get a lot of questions around how do I know that it's happening? How can I predict if it's going to happen? What are the signs? And there's millions of different signs that there could be that there is something going on. We can generally say, look for fear, look for when someone seems afraid or nervous when there's not really reason for that to be happening. But that, like was mentioned, doesn't automatically mean that dating violence or domestic violence is happening. So I think there's many other conversations, and like I was mentioning, trying to put together that pattern of behavior, this pattern of fear, this pattern of, how are you interacting with this person to really figure out what is going on. But there is unfortunately not just the one answer we can look for that is the predictor that this means that this is either going to happen or that this is happening.
It underlines the importance of having comfortable, intimate relationships with more than one person, because you can easily imagine that a teen who is suffering abuse might more easily speak to an aunt than a mother or whatever. I mean, you choose the pair. Carolyn, I'm sure that you've been involved in many sort of initial conversations about this. Maybe the first time that somebody has admitted what's going on. But is there a structure to that initial conversation that's important? In other words, you have one conversation, but that's clearly wouldn't normally be enough. So how do you sort of guide that conversation to encourage maybe another and another and another and actually get deeper into the issue?
Yeah, the structure of the conversation.
I might have put that badly, just when you have a conversation, if you just tell us like what your goal is for that would help.
Absolutely. I think the ultimate goal when we're initially having those conversations is to figure out what that person needs in the moment. So this is assuming that they've already disclosed, they've already told me what's happening. The next thing I'm going to ask them is, what are the things that you need right now? What are the most important things that you need to happen next? How can we prioritize your safety? And do you need or want any of my help with it? Because oftentimes they don't necessarily want me to do anything. They don't want me to take control. They don't want me to tell them, what I think they should do next. What they're actually just looking for is me to listen, and for me to be able to give them that space to tell as much or as little of their stories as they want to in that moment. And so for me to continue that conversation, if there's things that they do want support with, I will find a time when can we touch base about this? Can I do some research and, touch base with you about it in the future? If there's nothing they really need from me in the moment, it would be me asking them, how can we stay in touch? How can we make sure we're maintaining communication? Because it is incredibly isolating to experience domestic violence. And if the past few years have taught us anything, it can make it even more isolating when you are experiencing it through a pandemic. And so being able to find any way where you can email, go for a walk once a week, make sure you're maintaining some consistent form of communication, so you're maintaining as a close support for them, would be the way that, you would try to encourage conversations down the road, which would, take it deeper and maybe lead to more support down the road.
You mentioned the pandemic. Is there evidence, because I know people were suggesting that interpersonal partner violence might increase given the fact that people were being forced to stay at home. Is there any indication that it's on the rise during the pandemic?
If we're talking about numbers specifically, it might be best to go to Daenerys, but I can maybe just speak in terms of Jess, in terms of what we have seen is the people accessing our services have gone up by, I think, about 150%, if not 200% over the course of the past 2 years. I think we can say that for pretty much the entire social service sector, that we have been running at full speed, unfortunately, which means that there is a real need for it, and that there's a lot of people needing resources, and it's just gone up since it has all started. But in terms of numbers, if you don't mind, Daenerys, can I see if you have that on hand?
Yeah, I'm gonna have a not satisfying answer, which is for teens, we don't know yet. The context might be a bit different just because they're not typically living with their partner, though they might be experiencing increased cyber violence. But we don't know, but to what Carolyn's saying, like I just heard on the radio this morning, the shelters are all full. So we know generally that certainly during the pandemic, intimate partner violence has gone up, and that like most things with the pandemic, there are likely youth who are disproportionately experiencing increased violence because they might need to use that relationship for material things like food or shelter, and that can put them at increased risk, especially during a pandemic when they're more isolated. So I would expect that there are certain youth that really are suffering more because they aren't getting that social support that they might normally get in terms of remedies for dating violence.
Has social media, I mean, we're talking about interpersonal violence that ranges, across from coercive control to physical. Has social media worsened the coercive control part of that spectrum?
I think from what we know from research, I don't know if worsened, it's just given more outlets and more opportunities. So yes, now you can do a lot more in terms of tracking and things like that using social media. There are different risks like sharing passwords and other things. So it definitely introduces a new element, but it's a continuation of the kinds of behaviors we would see in person. At least that's how I view it in the research, just through a different format. But it certainly is something to be aware of because it does let a person track somebody else 24 hours a day.
Yeah, it is definitely, I think, what we would fall under the category of technology-based coercive control, not necessarily like a whole other entity in itself, but definitely increases a person's ability to harass, monitor, check up on all of the time.
Just as an indicator of how broad this topic is, I want to throw a couple of questions at you that are a little bit different. Here's one. What help is available to a male adult that is a survivor of emotional and physical abuse? Most people don't believe him, as his partner acts sweet to the general public, and most people follow the stigma that he is the abusive partner.
Do you want to go? Do you want to go first, Caroline, and then I can answer?
Sure, absolutely. Yeah. So a few different ways I want to answer that question is supports available for men who are experiencing domestic violence. There are far fewer resources that are available for men who are experiencing domestic violence. Many of them are built around women who experience domestic violence, for shelters, counseling groups, domestic violence resources, many of them. It is challenging for men to find resources that are available for them. That's not to say that they don't exist. They are more limited, but in Calgary, we do have a few that are available. Off the top of my head, I know the Calgary Women's Emergency Shelter, the Calgary Counseling Centre, places that do offer specifically counseling for men who have experienced violence. They are available. They are just less in number.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
That's what I would have said. So I think that's a good
response. So this question somewhat follows that, in that part of it where people outside the relationship think that the person being abusive is wonderful and sweet. So this question is, how likely is an abusive person to respond to attempts to set boundaries with, quote, "Sorry, won't ever do it again. Had no idea. I'm reformed now. You told me it's not okay. All good. Just give me another chance." That is definitely how it's portrayed, at least in the media, often. But so does that, well, I assume it happens, but you could correct me on that. And if that is what the abuser maintains, how can you break through that?
So I think this is where a developmental lens is really important. So a lot of youth who are using violence have a lot of capacity to grow and change because they're still very much figuring out who they are as a person, who they are in relationships, what's appropriate, what's not. So I think there is a lot of opportunity to do that teaching to help them see why the behavior they're using is harmful and to work with them to provide other options. So I think in that way, it's a little bit different than when you're working with adults who are using violence, although of course there's still room, as Carolyn would say, to teach and grow. But for youth, I think we don't want to look at them as abusers. We want to think about what's driving the behavior and really help them to learn a different way of interacting in the world. And that's something that we can do with prevention programming. So.
Yep. Good question. What mental health issues can evolve out of situations like this?
Do you want me to talk about the research? Do you want to talk about what you've seen in practice?
Why don't you talk about the research first? That's probably the best place to start with this.
Yeah, so I'll be clear to say, like, it's mostly symptoms, not necessarily mental health illness, but one of the things we want to be aware of is that a lot of mental illnesses start in adolescence. So if dating violence is being experienced, that might potentially be a risk factor for onset. So we would think about that. But certainly depressive symptoms are a common finding. And that makes sense if you're feeling scared in your relationship, unloved, unwanted. So looking out, and that's sort of some of those warning signs we talked about, kind of tap into that, being withdrawn, being really sad, being fearful. So anxiety, symptoms of anxiety. There's some research demonstrating connections with PTSD, but that's limited just because that's for a pretty specific subset of adolescents. But certainly it is a risk factor for poor mental health and potentially for the onset of mental illness. And so for lots of reasons, we want to prevent dating violence because it could improve mental health and it could prevent the cycle of violence we've talked about. So it is sort of a root cause that by preventing that, we can potentially prevent a lot of other bad things from happening.
Did you want to add something to that, Caroline?
I think you summarized that really well. I think we know that there can be mental health outcomes when the person is experiencing any kind of form of violence. And the only thing I would add to that is we also know that, the conversations we have, the support that they get, the ways, we can really try and counter the experience of the dating violence and of reducing isolation can really have some dramatic effects on, reducing those mental health outcomes in the future. So I think that just really reiterates why we're having that conversation here tonight and the role everyone plays in, helping address that.
It's a really important conversation. Now, here's a question, and I think we understand that there are many, many different situations that lead to interpersonal violence among adolescents. But this is a good question, I think. How should a teen who is shy or doesn't want to say no to something because they don't want other people to be disappointed in them or angry with them, not necessarily with a sexual partner, but in a general sense. So how can one help somebody like that who tends to want to say yes rather than no, I guess is the question.
I'm interpreting that as, we're suspecting something is happening, but this is more of like a shy individual and, they might just want to say, no, I'm fine. Like there's nothing wrong happening. Is that how, am I interpreting that?
Yeah, well, I mean, that would be important to discuss, but I think the sense of the question is that they don't want to break up with the person. They don't want to say no to the person who's abusing them.
Oh, I found the question now. I can look at it. I think that maybe this answers the question or it doesn't, but the thing that comes up for me is, and I mentioned that a little bit in my conversation, is oftentimes people do have that perspective of, they're not standing up for themselves. They're not setting their boundaries. They're not doing enough to defend themselves or to, stop this control that is happening to them. And I think, for any person, it is extremely overwhelming to experience the level of control and the level of power that a person holds in the relationship, regardless of whether you're shy, you're outgoing, whether you're confident, or, you're a bit more, you run on your own a little bit more. I'm not sure how else to phrase that, but I think for any person, it can be so challenging to set those boundaries. And people think, why didn't you just say no the first time? But how the person who, uses that kind of behavior can really put them in a position where they feel like they can't say no. So I'm not sure if there really is a difference for a shy individual or a confident individual. It is just extremely challenging. And we would hope they feel like they can set boundaries, but if they can't, then that's an indicator that there is something, not quite healthy about the relationship.
And, it sure puts the lie to the idea that was quoted earlier that, oh, if that were me, I would have just left right away. I mean, it's that may look like look that way to you from the outside. But the dynamics of relationships are much more complex than that. Here's an interesting question about sort of the aftermath. How to overcome the anger and desire for vengeance, how to rebuild my life when it has been destroyed mentally and physically. Tanira.
I just
Well,
want
I mean, yeah,
yeah,
go
no,
ahead.
I'm happy to. I just want to go back to something that you said about breaking up. So just to like add that I think for a lot of adults, that's sort of our like, well, then get out of it. But breaking up is something we generally don't want to recommend at like just first, you know, as soon as someone tells you. One, because if that's not what they want, they're going to stop telling you anything so that they can see their partner. Two, leaving aggressive or abusive partner is a really dangerous time, and you want to do that with the support of a domestic violence agency like the Calgary Women's Emergency Shelter. So just like, because I think that's a really common response. So thinking about how to sort of manage your emotions around that and ask, as Carolyn said, what the youth is looking for and not kind of jump to a solution. But in terms of the anger piece, I mean, that's fair. If you have experienced violence, anger is a natural emotion to have. And I think that is the importance of reaching out for mental health supports and really working through that. And, you know, sometimes there are legal remedies available, but honestly, for domestic violence, it doesn't happen that often. So I think it unfortunately falls to survivors to do a lot of their own healing work. And, you know, that's something that can be done, you know, someone like Carolyn or other mental health, Calgary Counseling Center. So really finding the support that you need to help heal from what has happened to you, because it is a violation and it is serious.
What I would add to that is actually that exact comment, you know, the feelings of anger or fear or sadness or, you know, anxiety, you know, after you leave a relationship, they don't just go away. They can linger and last for a very long time. So actually, Say Dress was born or developed 30 years ago because we recognized that there wasn't nearly enough resources for, at that time, women who were leaving shelters, and then they had no more supports after that, and they had nowhere to, you know, really talk about their experiences and to, like, you know, address those feelings of anger and fear and sadness that come from those relationships. So I would really just overemphasize that point from Dinara, that, you know, it is those supports about why Say Dress exists and why counseling and all of those supports are so necessary, is to be able to work through those emotions that last sometimes for, I can't even name how long, a very, very long time.
There are a couple of questions about the responsibilities of people who might not be, let's say, part of the family. So I'll read you these both. I think they are pretty much in parallel. What intervention measures can be taken by individuals other than caregivers? That's question one. And question two is, if a student discloses intimate partner violence to a teacher, is there a duty to report this to parents/caregivers?
I can take the second one if you want to take the first one. So to the second, so if folks are interested, if they go to, I can put in the chat, prevnet.datingviolence.ca, we have a map with all the legislation across Canada that applies to dating violence. In Alberta, the Education Act applies in terms of remedies, but also the Child, Youth and Family Enhancement Act. And so that's for everyone, including teachers, that if you reasonably believe a child needs intervention, you have a responsibility to report that to Child and Youth Services or the police. And so for dating violence, this would most likely look like a guardian who is unable or unwilling to protect their child from serious physical, emotional, and or sexual abuse. But I'm sure, as Carolyn can speak to, because these are youth, you really want to talk to them first and discuss the situation. So there is a responsibility, but do, you know, involve them if it's safe in that conversation. And Carolyn probably has more to say to that, but
The first question, sorry, I got sidetracked with the second question. Can you remind me the first question again?
Yeah, the first question was worded like this. What intervention measures can be taken by individuals other than the caregivers?
Yeah, so I don't know, maybe me looking at it from this, I feel like our whole kind of conversation this evening has been about, it's not just about the parents or the caregivers, all the, ways that we've talked about responding or asking questions or supporting youth don't just have to be from the parents. They can be by any trusted adult, any kind of support in any kind of setting. And so, while parents might have, that closer relationship with them, if it's a parent and child, any person can have that open conversation. Any person can ask the question and refer to resources and just make sure that that person knows, that student, that youth, that whoever at any age doesn't feel alone and like they don't feel like they have to take on the whole weight of their experience on their own shoulders, that we can help support them and make sure that they don't have to carry the full burden of it on their own. So I think that's pretty consistent for any person, regardless of your relationship with them. That's the whole concept around informal supporters, for sure.
Well, you're both doing really important work. Thank you for this. Carolyn, the website is suggest.org, correct?
Correct.
SAGESSE. So if those watching want more information about the organization you work with, that is a great opportunity. And Danira, your lab is hopelab.ca,
Yeah.
correct?
Yeah. And I just put that link in the chat I mentioned. It's a great website for an organization that I'm the scientific co-director for, and they have a policy map and we have lots on signs and tips for intervening. And so encourage folks to visit that if they're interested in learning more.
Well, thank you both very much. And I'm going to turn it over now to Councillor Courtney Brenner, who will wrap up the evening. And thanks again, Carolyn and Danira.
Wonderful. Thank you. Wonderful speakers, Dr. Dayanara and Carolyn, for joining us this evening. And thanks to the host, Jay Ingram, for all the information provided. Thank you to the presentation partner, the Mathison Centre for Mental Health Research and Education and the Hotchkiss Brain Institute. Thank you to the incredible staff at the library and to each of you for attending this installment of Think Big. A reminder, you will receive a link for an online survey about your experience at this event, and we ask that you complete it shortly. Your input is important. We want to hear from you as we plan upcoming Think Big events. And we look forward to seeing you at the next Think Big event.